It was actually
the sword made it, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sword's here.
You worked
That's
that
the
2
joke.
hours.
It took us 2 hours, guys.
It's like.
So we're still in our Harry Potter's application. Last time we added the static or semi-static pages, that ability to have these pages where we could also go to a /pages controller that was password protected, giving us the ability to edit these pages. The one thing that I added after the fact was just one little extra directive to the permalink action of the pages controller, which is the only action that is not authenticated. I'll comment this line out and then I'll show you why I put it in there. So if I go to contact or about, that's all well and good. If though I try to go manually to a permalink that doesn't exist in my database. So remember the way this permalink controller goes is the permalink comes to us by way of the routing system, because there's a placeholder in it. We retrieve it from the params hash, and then we say find by permalink. So if I pass it something that does not exist, what I'm going to get back is nil here. And so we get nil, and then when we get to the view, we try to call .title and .content on nil, and that doesn't work. And so the fix for that is just a really quick little guard statement where we say redirect to. So in Rails we can redirect, and that'll do a proper HTTP, probably like a 302 redirect. Where do I want to redirect to? I just pick the root path. So if someone tries to navigate to a permalink that does not exist, I redirect to the root path, and then I use if as a trailing modifier here if the page is nil. So that's just a really quick fix to avoid this problem. So now if I try to load up a permalink that doesn't exist, it just immediately goes back to the root path. So if I change that, it just goes back to the root. Well, I mean, if someone's just trying to type away and put in a path that doesn't exist in my website, that's fine, right? Yes, I mean, I guess I also could have done a 404, right? That this page is not found. See, that's the thing is Rails will do that on a find, but it doesn't do it on a find by. And so if I try to do a find by ID, yes, it'll automatically throw the 404 for me, but on a find by, it doesn't have that behavior. I could probably manually throw Rails's record not found exception, which is what triggers the 404 pages. So that would be another way of solving this problem. This in production? It would just straight up crash. You'd get a 500 error, and you'd get like the sort of the dreaded Rails screen, which is just a message that says something went wrong. And yeah, so that's not the nicest of messages for a user to get. So this avoids it, but yeah, if we wanted to do a 404, we'd have to throw the record not found exception from active record. So that's a little bit of a fix that I didn't have in there at the end of our class last time. Okay, so what I want now is just to demo how we would add many-to-many associations to this application. And I'm going to do that by setting up many-to-many association between students and teachers. And to keep things simple, I'm going to make it an appointment. I was originally going to make it a class, but then a class has like multiple times when it was scheduled, so I'd probably need a whole other database table to represent the schedule for a course. And so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to set up like sort of office hour appointments between students and teachers, and that way the appointment is going to have 2 foreign keys in it, right? It's going to be a join table. It'll reference the students table and the teachers table. And it'll also have an appointment date in it as well. Yep. Yes. Yeah, the whole repo is up on Git. It is, I think. Yeah. So if you go to github.com stungi-rrc. It's the Hogwarts on Rails. Let me just push the most recent version of my code. So you'll have that most recent change there. Push origin master. And there we go. So the most recent version of the code is now up on here. Nice.
What was the file you changed? You just changed one.
I just changed the pages controller, the permalink. And if you are going to clone it, remember that after you clone it, you'll need to run a Rails DB migrate and a Rails DB seed. Yeah, it's the first repo if you go to github.com/stungi-rrc. It's this one right here. So if we go to the Rails guides, we'll see an example, a similar example to what we're about to set up. So if I go to the Rails guides and I go to the Active Record Associations guide, we're going to look at the has many through association. And in the guides, their example is linking physicians to patients by way of something called an appointment. We're going to link teachers and students by way of appointment. So the ERD is effectively the same. We have two separate models, each with their own database table. In our case, we have a teacher's database table and a student's database table. And then we are going to create a new model called appointment. And in it, there are going to be two foreign keys, a foreign key to our teacher and a foreign key to our student. And we're also going to have an additional appointment date in there. And so that's the first thing that we're going to create is that new model, the appointment model. And we're going to do that from the command prompt with a Rails G for generate. We're generating a model. The model is called appointment. And we'll set up the two foreign keys first. And the way that Rails sets up foreign keys in the generator level is we use the references keyword. So we'll say this appointment references a student, and it also references a teacher. So student : references and teacher : references. And then what I also wanted is the little bit of data that's going to go along with each row in this appointments table, which is going to be the appointment date. So I'll say appointment date. They're making like an appointment with a teacher, like to say like to have like an office hour or something like that. And then the appointment is going to be a date time. So that's appointment _ date : date time. And then I am going to press enter. And so this is the command that we just ran, still at the top of the screen there. And it created a migration for me, which will be what creates the appointments table with the requested two foreign keys and the appointment date time. I've got a model as well. And because I built this appointment by way of a generator and I specified up front that the references were there, this model will already have the belongs to in it. So if I went and looked at that model, if I go to my app models appointment, it has belongs to student and belongs to teacher in there already. And so I'll just put a comment in here that there is a student ID foreign key in the appointments table, and there is a teacher ID foreign key in the appointments table. The generator only messes with the thing being generated. So the other side of these relationships, the other side of the many-to-manys that needs to be on the student and the teacher, those will not have been added for me, and I'll have to add those myself. So the belongs to, the to belongs to, because an appointment has 2 foreign keys, so it belongs to 2 things. Those get auto generated, but I have to open up the student and the teacher model and add to those. So we're on the other side of belongs to has many. So this is the has many side. So a student has underscore many appointments. And I can copy and paste that line over to teacher, because a teacher also has many appointments. And we could leave it like that, but the real power of these many-to-many associations is the ability to use Rails to traverse the entire association, to go from a teacher object and see all the students that teacher has ever had appointments with, or to go from the student object and see how many teachers or all the teachers that student has had appointments with. With just the has many, that won't work yet. But I can add to, for example, teachers here. I can say has many students, and then the extra thing that I have to say here, because it doesn't have many students directly, it has many students through another association, which is the appointments association. And the way this is written is a little awkward. It's through with a colon at the end of it, and then appointments is a symbol, so it has a colon at the left-hand side of it, and so it's through colon space colon appointments. So it's not a typo, that's how it has to be written. And the same thing is going to happen on the other side of the relationship. So a teacher has many students through appointments, and if I go to the student side of things, a student has many teachers through appointments. So this is one of 2 different main ways of setting up many-to-manys in Rails. The other way is more commonly used when you don't have any data in the join table. So in my join table, I have the appointment date. So I have some data there, which means that I would want a model associated with that join table. Sometimes it's only the join that matters and there's no data in that join table, and so that way you don't actually need that middle model. There's no reason to actually need to get access to the middle piece of the join, and for that Rails has another way of setting up these associations, which is has and belongs to many, which is there's an entry for that in the guides. The example they give is assemblies and parts, and for their assemblies parts table, it has 2 foreign keys on it and nothing else. And then you do not create a model for that. You just create a model for your assemblies, a model for your parts, and just a table for your assemblies parts. It has to be named after the 2 different tables that are being associated in alphabetical order. And so assemblies comes first because A is alphabetically before P, and so that's the naming convention that Rails is going to rely on. When you say has and belongs to many parts and has and belongs to many assemblies, Rails will then infer that the join table is named assemblies parts. And if you're working with a legacy system where you have the database set up already and maybe the join table is not named in that style, you can always override those conventions. So I could go to has and belongs to many, and I could specify what the table name was there, but I have to specify it in both places. You can always override those conventions, but it's best to work with them if you can. Okay, so at that point, I've created the associations. I haven't yet run my migration, so I can do that now. Rails DB migrate. And that creates the associated table. I'm going to commit to Git now. My Git ads are noisy now because I turned on, sometimes I'm working with Git in Linux mode, sometimes I'm working with Git in Windows mode, and Linux and Windows have different line ending characters. Windows uses 2 characters to represent a line ending. Linux and Mac only use 1 character to represent a line ending. And if you traverse the 2 OSs with a Git repository, Git will see the differences in line endings as a change. And that's super annoying, right? You don't want every single line in the file to be recognized as a change if all that is changed is the line ending. The line endings, you can always access that inside of VS Code here. You can specify which line ending you want it to be. So you could solve the problem by always ensuring that you're using only one type of line ending, or you can set up in Git, can't remember the exact command. GitHub had a little tutorial on it. Git line endings. It was just this one command that did it. Git config -- global core.auto crlf true. And that made it so that it doesn't matter if I'm working in Windows or if I'm working on my Mac or if I'm working in the Windows Linux subsystem, it does make it so that my ads are a little bit noisy because it's telling me that it's sort of auto fixing my line endings for me. It's ensuring that I'm using CRLF everywhere. Anyways, after I do an ad, I can do a commit, and I can say added the appointments join table with the associations in the correct models. And now we have the table in place. I can go look at it to see what it looks like if I go to my DB schema file. So there's my DB schema file. Here's that new table. So the table is called appointments. There's the 2 different foreign keys. It has a student ID. It has a teacher ID. It has that appointment date in there, which is the date time. It has the created at and updated at timestamps that all of our models have. And then Rails has put an index on both foreign keys to make retrieval through those foreign keys fast. So it's gone to the database and asked for like a database index on both of those things, which is nice. So now we're ready to, from within the seed script, create some appointments so that we can see how we would work with a many-to-many from within the seed script, which is something that you may do in your project, which is why I'm demoing it here. So I'm going to go to the seed script. Currently, the seed script simply has so it's doing 8 times, creating 8 different houses and a bunch of different teachers and students for each house. It's creating it up a bunch of different pages, or at least 2 different pages. I want it to create a few appointments just to sort of demo how that might be done. We could do this in a couple of different ways. We could create n different appointments, and for each one of them find a random teacher and find a random student and then like associate those. I could also build the appointments by way of a teacher or by way of a student. I'm going to do that way. So I'm going to go and find sort of n different teachers and have the teachers build the appointments and then associate random students to those appointments. So teachers, I'm going to say, go to the teacher model. I'll ask for all teachers, and then I'm just going to say, give me a sample of 10 of them. And that's just going to give me 10 random teachers from the collection of all teachers. Then I can loop through those teachers. And for each teacher, I can go to its appointments association and create an appointment. And to create that appointment, I need two things. I need an appointment date. And that's going to be equal to something. And I'm just putting a question mark in there as a placeholder. It's not valid Ruby or Rails syntax. And I need a student to fill out the other side of the association. So I'm going to fill something in there as well. So before this create statement is fired off, I need to first create an appointment date, and I also need to find the student to make this association to. And then the appointment will be auto-associated with the teacher because it's made by way of the teacher. So I'll find a student by just going to student.all.sample. That'll give me one random student from the collection. And I can change this here to that student variable. And then to get a random appointment date, I'm going to use Faker to do that for me. And so if I go to Faker, Faker time has the ability to do this dot forward, which gives you a random time sometime in the future specified by n days forward, so like up to 23 days forward, and then whether or not it's in the morning or the evening. And so I will create a appointment time here, or an appointment date from Faker, and I'll just say sometime in the next 30 days in the morning. All of the appointments will be in the morning. And that should be enough to get us, well, 10 appointments. It'll pick 10 random instructors. It'll create an appointment for each of those instructors associated with some student and a particular time, sometime between now and 30 days in the future. So if this was your project, you know, some of this data might be coming from the data source in question, so it wouldn't be as sort of generated in random unless you're using Faker as your only data set, in which case it might look something like this to set up a many-to-many. So let's run this to make sure it actually works. And again, I want a little bit of information coming out at the end of the script here so I can see the number of appointments that were created, just to ensure that that create statement is working. So we should see 10 for the number of appointments. Okay, so I'm going to run this from the command prompt here with a Rails DB seed. And we'll make sure that that is okay. Created 10 appointments, that looks good. If I went into the Rails console by going to Rails C, I should be able to find an appointment. So I'll say app equals appointment dot first. Here is an appointment. You can see it's been assigned a student ID and a teacher ID and an appointment date. That does not look like it is sometime in the morning, which is a little bit awkward, but it is a random day sometime in the future. Not sure why it didn't give us a morning. And I mean, that could be, it might be giving us like a Greenwich Mean Time, which then I guess it would be the morning if it's like we're like -6 off of Greenwich. So app.student.name, app.teacher.name. It looks like that is working. So my appointment or my appointments were properly generated. Another way to handle this is we could have done something like 10.times due, and then inside of here we could have like found a student, found a teacher, and then created an appointment where we, oh, I found an appointment date as well, and then set up all of that within here. So we could say like appointment date is the appointment date, and the student is the student, and the teacher is the teacher. So the reason those get repeated is that the blue part here is the key, and then this is the variable where that key is being saved. So this would have done, a similar thing. It would have set up, 10 different appointments. In this case, we're building the appointments by way of a particular teacher. In this case, we're building the appointment and telling it which student and which teacher to use. Two different ways of doing effectively the same thing. So a bit of a note on this .all.sample. If our database was giant, this would not be the best way of handling this. What's going to happen here is teacher.all is going to trigger a select star. So it's going to get every single teacher, and then sample is just something that we can call on an array to get 10 from that provided. So in our case, we only have, like 4 to 8 times 8 teachers. So getting all the teachers and then sampling 10, not the end of the world. If we had millions of rows or hundreds of millions of rows, we probably would not want to fetch all the teachers and then sample 10 from it. Nor would we want to within this loop. Every time we're going through this loop, we're first getting all of the students and then we're finding just one of them, right? Same thing here. Every single pass through this loop, Rails may cache the all. There's some caching built into Active Record. Nonetheless, it's still not probably the best way of handling this performance-wise because we're repeatedly sampling a giant data set. Yes, so you're gonna have to sit through it once no matter what. So there are alternatives, and so some of these, I'll just quickly show you what some of these alternatives are. In the case of what this script is doing, these alternatives would be overkill, right? This is not taking a long time to run, so we wouldn't bother going and optimizing it because it's already fast enough. That's at least my opinion around coding, is if the thing's already doing a decent enough job, you don't need to optimize it. That said, if it was really slow, there's a few ways we could optimize it. One way would be to use the database. And so you can, with most databases, run a query and order by random, and then limit by a certain number. So to do that in Rails, it's a bit of a hack. I gotta go to teacher, I say order, and then I got to know what database I'm dealing with, because the random function is not ANSI SQL, right? It's not standard across all different SQL implementations. In some SQL implementations, you have rand. So that'll work in MySQL and Postgres. We're using SQLite right now. It doesn't have a rand. It has a random. So this would not be portable if we had this in there because it's not ANSI SQL. There's no, in the original SQL specs, there is no random. So every vendor implements it in their own way. And I don't know why SQLite decided to use random instead of rand, but it makes your code not portable. And then we would like limit by 10. If we ran this, we would get a deprecation message because Rails sees this as unsafe. We're basically injecting a string of raw SQL directly into a SQL statement, and Rails is worried that there could be some way that this is coming from user data. And so Rails would throw up a deprecation notice saying, in Rails 6, this is no longer allowed. You can't just inject strings into your SQL because that is a recipe for SQL injection. if you're really sure of yourself, if you're sure that this is not coming, in this case it's not coming from user data, I've hard coded it. There's a way around that, but it makes this even more of a hack. I can go to what is called ARL. ARL is the relation gem that sits below active record. So active record is built on ARL, and ARL is basically like a set theory gem that implements, it's how the SQL is generated by active record. And so I'm going to ARL and I am taking the string and I'm sort of flagging it as this is safe SQL, and then I'm passing that to order, and then I'm limiting by 10. Thank you. And so that's one way of solving this problem, but it's a bit of a hack, right? If I had to go down to ARL, you really, that's sort of like not a public API. You're supposed to touch active record, not go below it. And I'm using something that is not portable. So if I went over to Postgres, this would no longer work. And I usually deploy with Postgres, so it would be breaking. Another way of solving this problem would be to like find a teacher offset by picking a random number from 0 to the count of teachers, and then finding the teachers by going to that teacher offset and then limiting by 10. So this one takes two different queries, but a count query is usually pretty darn efficient in most SQL implementations. And so that'll be one query, and the second query is going to be, it'll offset that many records into the database and then pick the next 10. So you pick a random offset up to the maximum record count. It should really be a random offset up to the maximum record count minus 10 though, shouldn't it? So that makes it even a bit more of a hack. If you went right to the end, you might not have 10 records to even get. So all three of these, this is like method A, method B, and method C. All three of those do the same things to different degrees of portability and or efficiency. This one is probably the most efficient and portable, but it's a little bit confusing to read. Nonetheless, I'll comment out everything other than the simplest case, because if we were to implement these other ones, we would probably also want that to be done here and here and here, and it would sort of muddy up our little simple example. But it's worth mentioning, because anytime you're working with a database, in the toy cases, when your database is really small, you're not really worried about performance, but eventually, your database will grow and these might become issues. And so it's worth looking into what is possible in these cases. All right, so if I ran the script now, I would get 20 different appointments. 10 of them created by way of the teacher, 10 of them created just as appointments and associated with the student and a teacher. In the end, it's going to be effectively the same thing. I'll leave my console and I'll rerun the seed script to make sure it still works. Oh, what did I do? Oh, yeah, this is a thing. That is because of what? Oh, that's because of the fact that I didn't go and delete the appointment. So when I go to try to destroy a student or a teacher, the database knows that there's like foreign keys outstanding, right? So I would leave like orphan foreign keys in the database. And so really, I should go to appointment.destroy all first, destroy all the appointments, and then destroy the things that have the foreign key relationships to those. I've destroyed all the orphans. Yeah, this is what happens. So there you go, 20 appointments. I should be able to run that as many times as I want now. Sometimes you want what's called a dependent destroy. sometimes when you destroy appointments or some kind of join table, you might actually want to destroy the associated records, right? So like that's the cascade, right? And it's very easy to set up a cascade in Rails. We would just add to the belongs to a dependent destroy option. So you would just say dependent : space : destroy. I don't want to do that in this case. I mean, I guess I could, but I won't. But you can do cascade deletes in Rails with that dependent destroy option. And that's all there really is to setting up a many-to-many relationship and then seeding data, at least random data, into that many-to-many relationship. I'm going to now give you a quick view of how I did the Board Game Geek website, just to show you how I'm pulling in data from a CSV file and how I'm dealing with the many-to-many relationships there, because they're slightly, there was a bit of a battle that I had to do in a few instances there. So I'll demo that in a second. I will just add and commit. Appointments. Okay, we'll put aside this for now. One second, I'll come see.
It's just like bootstraps.
So let's take a look at this here. This is the board game website that all the data comes from a CSV file. It's hard linking to images. Those are dead because the Board Game Geek website itself changed their URL structure. But nonetheless, it's complicated enough data here. The main database table is a board games table. And if we click in on a board game, we'll see that there are many-to-manys for designers and categories and mechanics. So there is a designers table, a categories table, and a mechanics table, and there's join tables for each one of them. Now for these, I could have used has and belongs to many, because there's no actual data on that join. I didn't. I'm just so used to working with the associations that I didn't, and I just did the has many throughs, but I could have just done a direct relationship. Nonetheless, we're going to take a look at how I pulled all of this data out of a single CSV file and sort of what some of the complications were. So the CSV file, I just dropped into my DB folder. Look at this wall of text in the mini map there. So this is a giant file. It's 5,000 rows, so it's not that bad. Top row of a CSV is almost always just your headers, right? Comma delimited list of your headers. So like the first thing is the rank, the second thing is the board game URL, and then an ID, blah, 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 blah. This is messy though, because for certain things, you get a quoted comma delimited string. So like the commas delimit certain things, and then you get inside of quotes. So this is like the mechanics. So when I go to that row, when I eventually parse this and I go to the row's mechanic column, it's actually a comma delimited list of mechanics. Same thing goes for the categories. It's a comma delimited, sort of a quoted comma delimited list of categories, and same things for designers. That's a bit awkward, right? They're storing like many-to-many stuff through a lot of data duplication. So like Rob Davio here, anytime Rob Davio is a creator of a game, his name will be used again in the list of designers for that game. So multiple times. So basically the CSV is like highly denormalized, and when I pull it into the database, I'm going to have to sort of renormalize the data a little bit. The data also needed to be cleaned up a little bit, and you can see here I've got the sort of the dreaded question mark inside of the diamond, which is an encoding issue. So this file it's stamped with being like a UTF-8 file, but it's not actually UTF-8 encoding. And that's because when Excel exports, and most CSVs come to us by way of like exporting from Excel, they don't actually save the data in UTF-8 encoding. They use a very strange encoding type. So after a bunch of Googling, I actually found the encoding type that Excel uses for exported CSVs. And so I had to reference that so that I didn't get like weird encoding errors in my data as well. So here's what I did. In the gem file, I pulled in a new gem called Smarter CSV, which is just a gem for dealing with CSV documents. It makes reading CSVs really, really easy. And in the seed script, I'm going to be making use of that Smarter CSV to process the CSV file. Just take a quick look at the schema. If we look at the schema here, I have my board games table with a column for most of the columns that are in the CSV. So like rank and the board game URL and the name and the min players and the max players. And I've named all of those things the same as the names that appear up here. I also have a categories table, a designers table, and a mechanics table. In each case, it's just a name that goes with each one of those things. And then my join tables, board game categories, board game designers, and board game mechanics. And those have my 2 foreign keys in them. And this is what I was saying, like because it only has just the 2 foreign keys, I don't need anything else in here. I could have done the other style of many-to-many. I just didn't do it at the time. So how did I do the seeding? Well, one, I figured out this encoding type. It's ISO 8859-1 is the magic encoding type that I needed to use. Of course, right? Yeah, in retrospect, it's hugely obvious. I don't know why Excel uses that, but that's what Excel exports with when it does a CSV export. I dropped the CSV into the DB folder, and Smarter CSV wanted a full complete path to it. And so to build up that full complete path, the Rails class has a class level method called root, which just gives you the root of your project folder as a full path. And then I just appended the DB and the name of the script to it. Okay, that was good. So that means that when I went to Smarter CSV, I could tell it to process the CSV file in question. The options allowed me to set the correct file encoding, and then Smarter CSV has this thing called key mapping that lets me either change the name of certain columns, so something that was named names in the CSV, I have it just be imported as name, and there was a few columns that I didn't even want, so I just had them imported as nil, and it just gets rid of those columns. What that gives me is a collection of board games. So I get an array where each entry in that array is a hash, where the keys of the hash are the columns from the CSV. So I get a game ID and a board game URL and a min player and a max player hash for each one of those, or a key for each one of those things. And then I looped through and I did an each with index. My only reason I did an each with index is because I wanted how far am I completed. The first time I ran this, it took a while and I wasn't sure if the script was stuck or how long it was going to take. So basically, I'm using the current index and just doing a little bit of math based on the actual size to figure out sort of how far I am into the data set. So it'll just, as it's looping, it'll say, oh, 1% done, 2% done, 3% done, like that. And I just did that for every 50 indices, it updates the completed at, and that sort of just scrolls by as my seed script is running. If I wasn't dealing with the mechanics, it would just be as simple as creating the board game using the current row. because I mapped the column names of the CSV and made them the same names in my database here, table, then I just pass the current row to the create statement and boom, it creates it one by one by one by one. So that would give me 5,000 different games in my board game table. There was these special categories though, which are acting as the many-to-many, where they are coming to me as a comma delimited list of things. And so for the mechanic, the category, and the designer, what I needed to do was I needed to split on the comma. That would allow me to take something like this list of economics and exploration and fantasy and fighting and split it into an array with each one of those things in different positions of the array. The data was messy enough though that in some cases there were spaces in front of each one of those things, but in some cases there weren't. So what I was left with was sometimes I split things out and there was a space in front of the words, and sometimes there was no space in front of the words. So I couldn't split on comma space, which is what I tried first. I had to split on comma, and then I had to do a dot map to the strip. So map allows you to create a new version of an array based on an old version array with a mutation performed to every element in that array. And strip is something that all strings have, which just takes off any padded white space at the beginning or the end of a string. So I'm going to the mechanics, splitting on comma, and stripping. There was also some bad data in there that sometimes there was a comma and then a blank and then a comma. So there was nils inside of my array. But luckily, again, Ruby comes to the rescue. Ruby has a compact, which if you give it a array that has nils in it, it just compacts those nils away. It just removes the nils from the array. So for each thing, I had to do split, strip, compact. Furthermore, I only discovered later on that the way that they were representing peoples whose names were junior. So if my dad's name was Kyle, I would be Kyle Geske Jr. And the way they were putting that into the database would be, or into their CSV file, was Kyle Geske, comma, Jr. So Junior was coming up as one of the board game, like one of the top board game creators was just Junior. Because the way I was doing it is I was splitting on comma, and it was seeing the comma for Junior and assuming that that was a new name. And so before I did the split, I had to do a G sub on the designer string to replace comma Junior with space Junior. Yeah.
When you're processing CSV, oh no, never mind.
It's okay. I went through a lot of those myself when I was doing this. I was just like, oh, seriously, Junior? Why? So I replaced the Junior, then I split, then I strip, then I compact. Finally, I'm left with an array of mechanics, an array of categories, an array of designers, and then I go and delete that data from the CSV row so that it won't be extra data in there when I go to create with the board game. So then I've sort of gone and taken those things and put them off into their own little arrays. This isn't so bad in terms of data cleanup. I've done a lot of data manipulation in my day, and this is pretty nice in terms of how much data cleanup I had to do. One of the biggest issues with in fact, one of the things I was listening to over the weekend was these people talking about machine learning, and they were saying machine learning, if you're working with existing data sets, it's 80% of the work is just cleaning up the data. And the other 20% of the work is the actual machine learning, because data sets are never really that good, right? Most data sets are human inputted. We're not captured with large scale data processing in mind and have all sorts of problems in them. And so data cleanup ends up being a big deal. So this was pretty simple data cleanup in terms of what I needed to do. I've then created a new game for every entry. So there's 5,000 games being created. And then I needed to set up my many-to-manys. So I loop through each one of these arrays. So I take my CSV mechanic array. But again, this was denormalized data. So every time the dice rolling mechanic appears, it appears again. And so I can't just create dice rolling every time I come across it. If dice rolling already exists in the database, I have to grab it reference to the existing dice rolling in the mechanics database table. If it hasn't been created yet, I want to create it. And the nice thing that Rails has for us is the find or create by. So as long as something is unique, and I've made a uniqueness constraint on all of these things for their names, then I can find or create by the name of the current mechanic. So as I'm looping through these mechanics, if the mechanic has never been added to the database, it gets added. If the mechanic is already in the database, I'll just get returned an object that references the existing mechanic. And then I can go to my join table and I can create an entry that links the game to the mechanic. This was the crucial aspect though here, is the find or create by, so that I wasn't creating like the mechanic over and over and over. I was finding it if it already existed or creating if it didn't. And I needed to do that for the category and the designer as well. And so in each case, I'm just creating the joined item by linking the current game with either the designer, the category, or the mechanic. That left me with my 5,000 games that I can paginate through here. And it left me with the ability, when I load up a game, to find the associated designers, categories, and mechanics, and then working the other side of the many-to-many association. For any given designer, I could show the games that they had created. For any given category, I could show the games that involve that category, and same thing for mechanics. The only other thing that was a bit tricky in this implementation is when I wanted to list the designers, the categories, or the mechanics, I also wanted to be able to show the number of games that were built using that particular thing, or for designers, the number of games that they had created. But that data is nowhere in my database. It needs to be calculated, right? It's there in terms of there are 123 entries in the many-to-many association between this particular designer and some game. But I needed to actually calculate that, and that proved to be a little bit tricky as well. The active record ended up looking like, go to categories, like this. So when I couldn't just find the category, I selected everything from the category, but I also selected by going and counting how many times that particular category shows up in the join table as game category count. And then I did a left join to the join table, and I grouped it on ID, and then I ordered it by the count, and that gave me the ability to actually know how many games or how many games had a particular mechanic or category with them. So that was a bit of an interesting way of having to find that information. Not something you'd have to do for your project, but it was something that I wanted to do in my example because I thought that would be interesting information, but it wasn't just a straight up query. I had to do a little bit of research to figure out how to do that. And again, this is something I would have been more comfortable doing in just straight up SQL, right? Because that's a fairly common thing to do in SQL. And this is just the active record way of doing it. But you notice I had to drop down to a little bit of SQLing, like hard coded in there. So, yeah, you don't like that? How would you do it in SQL? Like, wouldn't you end up writing the same kind of query in SQL? Than this, yes. It makes for what would have been very easy to read in SQL. It sort of obfuscates the query when you bring it into active record like this. Which is why like active record is great for like 90% of what we do on the web, because a lot of times with websites we're not doing really complicated SQL. Yeah, right? Because it's like how, I mean, this is the one case in a million where I had to do something a little bit beyond what active record does. But really, most websites are just straight up CRUD, right? And you know, at most, you're joining one other table. So. Yes, but that's not just straight up website design, right? That's like working at a large enterprise that has like how many tables? Yeah. Yeah. So for most run-of-the-mill websites, you're not dealing with that. But yes, things go crazy when you're no. And so like if you're working at a large enterprise, you probably would not want to be having an abstraction layer between you and the database because SQL is such a powerful language, right? So you would just want to write straight up SQL in most instances when working with that kind of complexity. And I think that's all I wanted to share with you for today. As I mentioned before, is there anything else that's troubling you or that you've got questions about that might be blocking you in terms of getting you going for the project? One of the things, if you are pulling data from some kind of data source, do take a look to see if that data is going to require extensive cleanup before you actually commit to using that data source. Also remember that you can get away with just using Faker. If you just want the one data source, you can just use Faker and have it generate all of your data for you. You don't get as many points, but that would be sort of the simplest way to dive into the project. The other simplest way that's just a little bit more complicated is pulling a data set and then adding some related data using Faker, rather than finding like two disparate data sets and trying to make an association between them. That would probably be the most complicated of ways. So that's all I got for you. And then remember, no classes on Thursday for this course.